All right, so I'm about to read 50 toss-ups over authors and works that are contained within the part of the literature study packet of Montaigne through Poe. So just play along, and hopefully you'll get a lot of questions right and before the end of the question. So toss-up number one, we're just going to go straight through them. The title character of one of this man's novels falls for her cousin Charles, but must marry Cruchot de Buffons to pay off his debts. This author of Eugenie Grandet wrote of Raphael de Valentin's discovery of a wish-granting piece of shagreen in the wild ass's skin. The scientist David Chechard is the best friend of Lucien Chardon, a poet who loses his idealism in another novel by this author. In another of his novels, Eugene de Rastignac pursues Delphine de Nucingen, one of the two selfish daughters of the title all-sacrificing father. For 10 points, name this French author who included Lost Illusions and Le Pere Goriot in his Human Comedy. And that is Honoré de Balzac is the answer. Balzac. Number two, in one of her novels, Luddites attacked Robert Moore's mill, and this author created Lucy Snowe in her novel Villette. This author of Shirley also wrote a novel in which the title character is haunted by the ghost of Uncle Reed and learns that Reverend St. John Rivers is her cousin. That character, created by this author, is employed in a household where Grace Poole looks after Bertha Mason, the crazed wife of Edward Rochester. For 10 points, name this author of Jane Eyre. And that is Charlotte Bronte, one of the Bronte sisters. Toss-up three. One poem by this author ends, "She's dead. When thou knowest this, thou knowest how Jane a cripple the world is," or how lame a cripple this world is. This writer of An Anatomy of the World wrote a work which describes what happens as virtuous men pass mildly away, and is addressed to someone who makes him end where he begun. Yet another describes an insect which sucked me first and now sucks thee. Those poems are The Flea and A Valediction Foreboding Morning. Another work by this author ends by informing a character that thou shalt die because it is slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. For 10 points, identify this poet who included Death Be Not Proud in his holy sonnets. And that is, of course, John Donne, the metaphysical poet. Toss-up four. Letters between this person and Arthur de Gobineau were posthumously published, and he is referred to in the subtitle of a Bernard-Henri Lévy's work, American Vertigo. This man argued that the lack of a strong middle class led to tyranny in the old regime and the French Revolution. His best-known work described the titular form of government, an irresistible tendency in modern societies. That work by this author was the result of an 1831 mission to the United States with Gustave de Beaumont that was originally to examine prisons. For 10 points, name this French author of Democracy in America. And that is Alexis de Tocqueville. Toss-up number five. This author wrote a play in which Eugenia is kidnapped by the cleric under the orders of the Duke's secretary. This author of The Natural Daughter also wrote a poem involving a boy being rejected by a flower, Heath Rosebud. This author founded Weimar classicism with his great friend Friedrich Schiller. An epistolary novel by this author inspired copycat suicides across Europe, as many readers found themselves jealous of Albert for the affections of Lot. A two-part verse play by this author has highlights like a contract signed in blood and a poodle transforming itself into the devil. For 10 points, name this German Sturm und Drang poet of Faust. And that is Goethe, spelled Goethe, but pronounced Goethe. Toss-up number six. One of this author's works begins by invoking the patron of true holiness, which foul error doth defeat. He dedicated a collection in which includes a poem, One Day I Wrote Her Name Upon the Strand, to his future wife, Elizabeth Boyle. 8 lines of pentameter, followed by an Alexandrine, make up this poet's namesake stanza form. This author of Amoretti and Epithalamion created the villainous sorcerer, Archimago, and the heroic Red Cross Knight. This namesake of a sonnet form is best known for an allegorical epic poem about Gloriana, who represents Elizabeth I. For 10 points, name the 16th century author of The Fairy Queen. That is Edmund Spenser, The Fairy Queen. Toss-up 7. This book includes the character Margaret Saville, who is addressed in letters throughout the book. One character in this book reads Plutarch's Lives while simultaneously observing the lives of the de Lacys, who live in a cottage. The protagonist's friend, Henry Clerval, and his wife, Elizabeth, are murdered in this book by a character who flees to the North Pole. That character had earlier forced Victor to make him a companion after that character had been rejected by everyone it met due to its hideousness. For 10 points, name this book by Mary Shelley, where the title scientist creates a monster out of human body parts. and that is Frankenstein, or modern Prometheus, it's sometimes referred to as, but Frankenstein. Toss-up 8. In one of this author's stories, a grub man is introduced to the title character despite him being unused to dinners. The terrified title character of another story by this author gets a daily shave and is asked, what has cast such a shadow upon him? A captain is forcibly directed by a slave, Babo, in a work from his The Piazza Tales, and he created a character who was fired from a job with turkey and nippers. This character wrote of a clerk in a law office who refuses to do work with the phrase, I would prefer not to. For 10 points, name this author of Benito Sereno and Bartleby the Scrivener, better known, however, for penning Moby Dick. And that is Melville, Herman Melville. Toss-up number 9. This author, who proclaims, I was angry with my friend, at the beginning of one poem, wrote Vala about characters like Luva, Tarmas, and Urizen, created by the fall of Albion, 3 of the title 4 Zoas. This author of A Poison Tree and The Sick Rose created a character who can scarcely cry, weep, in a poem, which shares its title with one about a little black thing among the snow, the chimney sweeper. In one poem, this writer asked, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry, and describes the title animal as burning bright. For 10 points, name this romantic poet of the tiger, included in his collection, Songs of Experience. That is William Blake. William Blake. Toss-up 10. In a poem, this author imagines cloudy symbols of a high romance that the speaker may never live to trace with the magic hand of chance. This author of When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be stated, a thing of beauty is a joy forever, in a poem that imagines the love of Cynthia for the title Greek shepherd. Percy Bysshe Shelley commemorated this man's death in a poem that begins, I weep for Adonais. This author of Endymion wrote a ballad which asks, what can ail thee to a knight at arms? In a different poem, this writer of La Belle Dame Sans Merci addresses a still and ravished bride of quietness and declares, beauteous truth, truth, beauty. For 10 points, name this poet of Ode on a Grecian Urn. And that is, of course, John Keats. Toss-up 11. This writer praises a fictional Tuscan named Sporina, who mutilated his own face to destroy his beauty in a work that attacks Julius Caesar for his pursuit of pernicious fame. This writer asked, who knows if I am not a pastime to my cat more than she is to me, in a work about the Spanish author of natural theology. A piece by this author sarcastically concludes by pointing out that an apparently noble Brazilian tribe doesn't wear trousers. This man wrote, what do I know? In a piece that advocates skepticism, defends the theologian Raymond Sebond, and was collected with Of Cannibals. This man's major work is a group of writings which gave their name to a literary genre meaning attempts. For 10 points, name this French author who pioneered the essay. And that is Montaigne. Toss-up 12. In this novel, one character's family wants him to marry a half-Jewish orphan named Miss Schwartz. One character in this novel wraps green yarn around a man's arms while making a purse. And this novel includes the question, which of us is happy in this world? The main character in this novel, which is framed by a puppet show, probably kills Joss for life insurance at its end. The protagonist of this novel plays a role of Clytemnestra and throws a dictionary out of a carriage. In this novel, Dobbin survives the war, but George Osborne dies just before the Battle of Waterloo after impregnating Amelia Sedley, a former student of Mrs. Pinkerton's academy and a friend of the anti-heroine Becky Sharp. For 10 points, name this best-known novel by William Makepeace Thackeray, and that is Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair. Toss-up 13. This novel's title character whispers the word one into the ear of a corpse of a man who died the moment he acknowledged the existence of God. A character in this book adopts the false name Viscount Andrea Cavalcanti when he is introduced to society by a man called Lord Wilmore. During the Roman Carnival, the protagonist of this novel arranges for a young man to be kidnapped and taken to the catacombs by a gang of bandits. The title character of this novel decides to not duel Albert de Morcerf, the son of his former betrothed Mercedes. This novel's title character befriends the Abbe Faria when he is wrongly imprisoned for 14 years. For 10 points, Edmond Dantes takes the title alias while on a quest for revenge in what novel by Alexander Dumas? And that is The Count of Monte Cristo. Toss-up 14. In a work by this writer, one character tricks another into killing her by telling him that she has an ointment that can protect a person from getting wounded when stabbed. In that work, the title character burns down the city where his love died. The prologue of another work by this writer is narrated by a caricature of Machiavelli. In that work, the title character kills his daughter, Abigail, after she converts to Christianity. The title character of that work ends up being betrayed by his slave, Ithamore, and dies in a cauldron. For 10 points, name this Elizabethan playwright of Tamerlane the Great, the Jew of Malta, and Dr. Faustus. And that is Christopher Marlowe. Toss-up number 15. In one of this man's dramas, Hilaret and Capitaine Constant expose the corruption of Justice Squeezum. A cow eats Tom Thumb in his The Tragedy of Tragedies. After this man's career in the theater ended with the passage of the Licensing Act of 1737, he wrote a novel in which Lady Booby attempts to corrupt the title character, Joseph Andrews. For 10 points, name this British author of a novel about a foundling who loves Jenny and was discovered by Squire Allworthy, Tom Jones, and that is Henry Fielding. Toss-up 16. The protagonist of this novel mocks book reading while arguing against predestination in a speech that repeats his claim to be racially pure, man without a cross. In this novel, a massacre begins when a man hits a baby after its mother wraps it in a colorful shawl. A comic relief character in this novel, the zealous singing Master David, is wounded when the characters escape a cavern behind a waterfall. In this novel, Long Longue Carabine thwarts the burning of 3 prisoners tied to trees. This novel opens with Duncan Hayward leading Cora and Alice to Fort William Henry and climaxes with a cliffside battle in which Uncas dies. For 10 points, name this novel in which Hawkeye's friend Chingachgook becomes the title character, a work of James Fenimore Cooper. And that is The Last of the Mohicans. Toss-up 17. In one of this author's poems, he describes how a certain type of person swears with "I do vim" or "I tell yeow," and concludes with the line, "Logic is logic, that's all I'll say." This author coined the term Boston Brahmin, and his prose works are collected in his Breakfast Table series. The narrator of another of his poems hears clearer notes than ever Triton blew from the titular Ship of Pearl. In another poem, he advocates to give her to the god of storms rather than letting her shattered bulk sink. And that poem describes the USS Constitution. For 10 points, name this father of a Supreme Court justice, the fireside poet of Old Ironsides, and the chambered Nautilus. I forget the name. Well, I might have to skip that one. Why is it not? Oh, Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. Jr. is the Supreme Court Justice. Toss-up 18. One of this author's works begins with a soldier asking to leave him a little while as yet 'tis early morn at the title location. Another work by this author, when the title character looks at Sir Lancelot, her mirror cracks and she is cursed. This author of Locksley Hall and the Lady of Shalott wrote in one poem, "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." This poet of Crossing the Bar asked, "When can their glory fade of the 600 that rode into the valley of death?" For 10 points, name this poet of In Memoriam A.H.H. and The Charge of the Light Brigade. That is Alfred Lord Tennyson. Toss-up 19. In this novel, the anchoress, Sister Gudule, believes her child was tortured by the gypsies, and the daughter would later marry a struggling poet who is almost executed by the truands, Pierre Gringoire. The captain of the king's archers, Phoebus, falls in love with a character in this work who is almost kidnapped by a man who only leaves during the Festival of Fools and rings church bells to show his devotion to the main antagonist. Archdeacon Claude Frollo kills Esmeralda in, for 10 points, what Victor Hugo work in whose English title references a deformed and ugly Parisian. It is The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Or Notre Dame. Toss-up 20. A poem that shares its title with this poem wonders, what powerful but unrecorded race once dwelt in that annihilated place? This poem shares its name with a poem published by the author's friend, Horace Smith, and the speaker of this poem describes a wrinkled lip and a sneer of cold command. This poem is framed as a conversation with an antique traveler from a foreign land, who describes a statue where the words, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," are described. For 10 points, name this Percy Shelley poem about a statue of a king of kings. Ozymandias. Ozymandias is the answer. Toss-up 21. In one poem by this writer, Oswald Wycliffe holds the title Lord Rokeby prisoner. In another of his novels, Julia is involved with Van Beest Brown, and Ellengowan is inherited by Harry Bertram. In another novel by this author, Desdicado competes in a tournament attended by Athelstane and Locksley. This author's Guy Mannering, The Bride of Lammermoor, and Rob Roy are included in his Waverley novels. Another work by this writer features Cedric of Rotherwood, who is the protector of Lady Rowena, a woman who eventually marries the title knight. For 10 points, name the Scottish historical fiction author behind Ivanhoe. Ivanhoe is Sir Walter Scott. Toss-up 22. A narrator of this novel dreams that a ghost's hand reaches into his room and breaks his window. A character in this novel throws hot applesauce in the face of a character who insults his hair. A protagonist of this book is adopted from an orphanage in Liverpool. This novel's narrators are Mr. Lockwood, who rents a room at Thrushcross Grange, and the maid Nellie Dean. In this novel, Isabella Linton marries Heathcliff, who loves Catherine Earnshaw. For 10 points, name this only published novel by Emily Bronte, and that would be, of course, Wuthering Heights. Toss-up number 23. This poet wrote about a man who asks for directions in a pilgrim shadow. The title entity of one of his poems is a daughter of old time who preys upon the poet's heart, while the addressee of another poem reminds the speaker the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. In addition to Sonnet to Science and To Helen, he wrote about the tintinnabulation that so musically wells from the title objects, and about a maiden who lives in a kingdom by the sea. For 10 points, identify this author of The Bells and Annabel Lee, who wrote a poem about a visitor on a midnight dreary titled The Raven, and that is, of course, Edgar Allan Poe. Toss-up 24. This author wrote a poem that describes the great chieftain O' the Puddin' Race. That poem is often read on his birthday, January 25th, before eating his namesake supper. In addition to penning My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose and Addressed to a Haggis, this author described a crawling wonder and small, sleek, cowering, timorous beastie in 2 poems about small animals, To a Louse and To a Mouse. For 10 points, identify this national poet of the Scots dialect who also wrote New Year's song Auld Lang Syne, and that is Robert Burns. Toss-up 25. This poet notes that he'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn in his sonnet, The World is Too Much With Us. This poet wrote, Strange fits of passion I have known, and A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal, which are some of his Lucy poems. This poet described an outing with his sister Dorothy when he saw a host of golden daffodils in his poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Another of his poems notes that 5 years have passed since he saw the title church on the banks of the Wye. For 10 points, name this romantic poet of Tintern Abbey who wrote lyrical ballads with Coleridge, and that is William Wordsworth. Toss-up 26. In The Three Sisters, Masha repeatedly jumbles the first lines of a work by this man. That work describes a storytelling cat chained to a green oak tree by the shores and recounts Chernamor's abduction of a bride. One of his novels sees Pyotr give his coat to a man who is revealed to be Pugachev. In that work, Mironov is hanged, and Masha begs Catherine the Great to pardon her lover. One of his characters chooses Guillaume, and his second in a duel insulting Zaretsky. That novel alternates masculine and feminine rhymes and sees the title dandy seduce Olga and shun Tatiana. For 10 points, name this author of Ruslan and Ludmilla, The Captain's Daughter, Boris Godunov, and Eugene Onegin, and that is Alexander Pushkin. Toss-up 27. This work begins with a quote from Sir Thomas Browne and ends when Adolphe Le Bon is released from prison. A sailor in this work describes how his razor was stolen, and the confectioner Alberto Montaigne and Alfonso Garcio disagree in their report whether a person spoke Russian or English. In this work, a report that the corpse of Camille L'Espagne was discovered in a chimney leads the protagonist to realize the murderer was actually an orangutan. For 10 points, name this story that introduces the detective C. Auguste Dupin by Edgar Allan Poe, and that would be The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Toss-up 28. In this novel, the housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, shows a boyhood portrait of an estate's owner to the Gardeniers and their niece. Gardeners, I guess. This novel's protagonist refuses to make a promise not to get engaged to the master of that estate by Lady Catherine de Bourgh. or de Boer. In this novel, Charlotte Lucas marries the clergyman Mr. Collins, and Lydia runs away from Longbourn with the militia officer George Wickham. In this novel, the owner of Netherfield, Charles Bingley, marries Jane. For 10 points, name this novel where Elizabeth Bennet falls in love with Mr. Darcy by Jane Austen. And that would be Pride and Prejudice. Toss-up number 29. The narrator of this story tells the reader that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses. This story's narrator is provoked to attack a man because of his vulture blue eye. At the climax of this short story, the narrator is unsuspected by the police, but his perception of an increasingly loud sound resembling a watch wrapped in cotton causes him to break down and confess. For 10 points, name this horror story by Edgar Allan Poe, whose narrator hears the title body part beating under the floorboards. And that is, of course, The Telltale Heart. Toss-up 30. In one work by this author, Lady Waldemar wants the title character to convince Marion Earle and Romney to break up. This poet wrote the verse novel Aurora Leigh and began one collection with the line, I thought once how Theocritus had sung. The 33rd poem in that collection by this author begins, Yes, call me by my pet name. For 10 points, name this poet who asked, How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. In her collection, Sonnets from the Portuguese. And that is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Toss-up 31. A work by this man claims that life is a self-evolving, one of the title things, of which the horizon is the second and the eye the first. This author examined essences unchanged by man that make up the not me in an 8-part essay and criticized faith that stands on authority in an essay about a concept within which every man's particular is being contained. He wrote a passage in which all mean egotism vanishes as the speaker becomes like a transparent eyeball. In another essay, he asserted that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, and urged the reader to trust thyself. For 10 points, name this author of Circles, The Oversoul, and Self-Reliance, whose essay Nature outlines the foundations of transcendentalism. And that's Ralph Waldo Emerson. Toss-up 32. A character in one of this author's stories is speculated to have become a justice of the 10-pound court, and horses in that story include Daredevil and Gunpowder. In another of this author's stories, the protagonist, while out with his dog Wolf, encounters the ghosts of Henry Hudson's crew very loudly playing ninepins. That character sleeps for 20 years, and this author's most famous protagonist vies for Katrina von Tassel with Brom Bones before disappearing after a chase with the Headless Horseman. For 10 points, identify this American author of Rip Van Winkle, who told the tale of Ichabod Crane in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And that is, Washington Irving. I don't know why I blank sometimes. Toss-up 33. A book by this author was one of the first sea novels and sees the sailors Dick Fid and Scipio Africanus encounter the title pirate, the Red Rover. Judge Marmaduke Temple is a character in a novel by this man set on Lake Otsego. A possibly satirical attack on this man's cliches was written by Mark Twain and describes his literary offenses. In his most famous novel, the Monroe family are aided by Uncas and Chingachgook, who are friends with a man whose epithets include Hawkeye and the Deerslayer. Natty Bumppo and the Leatherstocking Tales are creations of, for 10 points, what American author of Last of the Mohicans? And that is James Fenimore Cooper. Toss-up number 34. Frankincense is extracted from trees whose Latin name refers to this Scottish author. A diarist whose journal of a tour of the Hebrides, describes a journey taken with another author. For 10 points, name this good friend and biographer of Samuel Johnson, and that is James Boswell. Toss-up the next. In On Heroes and Hero Worship, this author attributes the phrase, the fourth estate, to Edmund Burke. Another of his books, Sartor Resartus, follows a philosopher of clothing named Diogenes. And the answer there is, I've forgotten it already. Sartor Resartus. I'll have to look it up, as will probably you. Toss-up 36. The speaker of one of this author's poem rambles about an intellectual breeze to his pensive Sarah. The speaker of another of his poems tells of the symphony and song of an Abyssinian maid who is singing about Mount Abora as the damsel with a dulcimer. In one poem, this writer of The Aeolian Harp described a dice game between life in death and death. He opened another work by describing the title figure decreeing a stately pleasure dome in Xanadu. This man described a sailor who is cursed after his crew shoots down a large albatross. For 10 points, name this romantic poet of Kubla Khan and the rhyme of the ancient mariner, and that is Coleridge. Coleridge. Toss-up 37. One character in this novel breaks off his engagement to Blanche Ingram, and another has the word resurgam placed on her tombstone after dying of consumption. That character, Helen Burns, attended the Brocklehurst-run Lowood School with this novel's protagonist, who rejects St. John Rivers and a chance to be a missionary's wife in India after hearing her former love call her name. That man had been secretly married to the mad Bertha Mason, who burns down Thornfield Hall. For 10 points, identify this novel whose protagonist eventually marries Rochester, the most famous work of Charlotte Bronte. And that is Jane Eyre. Toss-up number 38. An old man's desire to arrange flowers into nosegays delights this work's protagonist, and earlier several men are slapped during a parlor game as they attempt to count to 1,000. The protagonist does a dramatic reading of the Irish poet Ossian, who he claims is superior to Homer, and after resigning a post secured for him by Wilhelm and returning to Valheim. There he finds that Albert has married his love Charlotte and borrows a pistol to shoot himself in the head. For 10 points, name this epistolary Sturm und Drang novel about a melancholic young artist by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And that is, of course, The Sorrows of Young Werther. Looks like Werther, but Werther. Toss-up number 39. In the opening of this book, Father Maple provides a sermon about Jonah. That sermon is attended by one of the harpooners, whose coffin, ironically, ends up saving another character's life. The main human character of this book offers a gold doubloon to whoever finds the title character first. One character in this book, named Queequeg, is one of the many people on the crew of the Pequod. This novel's first words, "Call me Ishmael," reveal the name of the only person on the crew to survive the book. For 10 points, name this Herman Melville novel about Captain Ahab's unsuccessful fight with the titular white whale, and that is Moby Dick. Toss-up number 40. This author wrote about twins George and Henry Warrington in The Virginians, which centers on the grandsons of this author's character, Henry Esmond. The protagonist of this writer's best-known work plays Clytemnestra during a game of charades. In this author's best-known novel, William Dobbin ultimately marries Amelia Sedley after her first husband, George Osborne, dies in the Battle of Waterloo. This author of The Luck of Barry Lyndon titled his best-known work after a location in Pilgrim's Progress. For 10 points, name this author who wrote about Becky Sharp in Vanity Fair. William Makepeace Thackeray is the answer there. Number 41. A character in this novel is scheduled to meet at the Carmelite Convent in Bethune with John Felton. In this novel, a man from Meung, later revealed to be the Comte de Richefort, insults the protagonist's horse. The epilogue of this book begins by revealing the result of the siege of La Rochelle. A tattoo of a fleur-de-lis reveals that the wife of one of the title characters of this novel was an ex-felon. That woman, Milady de Winter, is involved in a blackmail plot by Cardinal Richelieu, who is one of this novel's protagonists. For 10 points, name this novel in which D'Artagnan joins Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, which was written by Alexandre Dumas. And that is The Three Musketeers. Toss-up 42. A character in this work goes undercover as Monsieur Madeleine after stealing silver from Bishop Myriel. That character rescues a sailor caught in the rigging of a ship and uses the resulting chaos to escape. Gavroche is killed while collecting ammunition, and another character in this novel is fired from the protagonist's factory. The protagonist settles down at Gorbeau House after confronting Thénardier and retrieving Cosette, who promptly falls in love with a revolutionary named Marius. For 10 points, name this novel in which Javert attempts to apprehend Jean Valjean by Victor Hugo, and that is Les Miserables. Les Miserables. Toss-up 43. One of this man's poem asks, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Another of his poems describes life as a dome of multicolored glass, and the soul of the détective like a star, which beacons from the abode where the eternal are. This author of Ode to the West Wind and an elegy for John Keats, Adonais, wrote a poem whose speaker begs the title creature to teach me half the gladness that thy brain must know. That poem opens, Hail to thee, blithe spirit, while another of his poems describes two vast and trunkless legs of stone. For 10 points, name this poet of To a Skylark and Ozymandias, and that is Percy Shelley, husband of Mary Shelley. Toss-up 44. An author with this surname penned a line beginning, all true histories contain instruction, which opens a novel in which the flirty Rosalie regrets marrying Lord Ashby. That author created a character who helps Nancy Brown read the Bible, during which she meets her future husband, Edward Weston, and works as a governess for the Bloomfield and Murray families. Another author with this surname wrote a novel that includes the dog's Fanny, who is hanged during an elopement of its owner, Isabella, and Skulker, who bites a girl at Thrushcross Grange. Nellie Dean tells Mr. Lockwood the history of the Earnshaw family and its adoptive member, Heathcliff, in a novel by that author. For 10 points, give the surname shared by the authors of Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights. And that, of course, is the Bronte sisters. Bronte, Toss-up 45. This poem's narrator asks, "Is there balm in Gilead?" before telling the title entity to get thee back to the temple and night's Plutonian shore. That narrator's quaint and curious volumes surcease him of sorrow for the rare and radiant maiden Lenore. This poem's title creature sat upon a pallid bust of Pallas just above the chamber door it had earlier gently rapped and tapped upon, beginning once upon a midnight dreary, while the narrator pondered weak and weary. For 10 points, identify this Edgar Allan Poe poem whose title bird keeps repeating nevermore. And that is The Raven. Toss-up 46. At a party in this novel, a pregnant woman socializes with the guests while her husband hides behind a newspaper. A letter rejecting a woman in this novel is accompanied by a lock of the woman's hair that the sender had cut and kissed. A couple in this novel meet when the man helps the woman up after she slips and falls in the rain. A man in this novel is disinherited by his aunt for seducing a 15-year-old Eliza Williams. In this novel, Robert, the brother of the proprietress of Norland Estate, marries the gold digger Lucy Steele. A woman in this novel ends up with the older Colonel Brandon instead of the charming John Willoughby. For 10 points, Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood personify the two title traits of what novel by Jane Austen? And that is Sense and Sensibility. Toss-up 47. The sixth part of this poem begins as a dialogue between first voice and second voice. A character of this poem remarks, "I fear thee, thy glittering eye, and thy skinny hand so brown." This poem describes a fearsome nightmare who represents life in death. It ends with a line about a guy who awoke the next morning a sadder and wiser man. This poem describes a painted ship upon a painted ocean and slimy things that did crawl with legs. It coined the phrase, "water, water everywhere." The speaker tells the wedding guest that he shot an albatross. For 10 points, name this rhyme written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and that's the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Toss-up 48. This man wrote a novella about twins who feel each other's pain, the Corsican Brothers, as well as a historical novel about a gardening competition in Holland, The Black Tulip. One of this man's trilogies centers on a Gascon youth who loves Constance and includes 20 years after. Felton is convinced to kill the Duke of Buckingham in another novel of his, which features a king's brother in prison called The Man in the Iron Mask. His characters include Milady de Winter, an agent of Cardinal Richelieu. For 10 points, name this French author who created Aramis, Athos, and Porthos, and D'Artagnan in The Three Musketeers. And that is, of course, Dumas, Alexander Dumas. Toss-up 49. In one section of this work, the narrator takes a trowel out of his reliquaire to demonstrate he is a mason, and soon after he tells a friend his family motto is Nemo me impune lacessit, the narrator points out nitre gleaming on cavern walls and offers to impose on Lucchesi rather than his sick friend. The narrator ends his retelling with In pace requiescat, after stating that for half a century no mortal has found the bones of the acquaintance whom he lured to his vaults due to his proud wine connoisseurship. After crying, "For the love of God, Montresor," Fortunato is buried alive in, for 10 points, what short story by Edgar Allan Poe? And that is The Cask of Amontillado. The Cask of Amontillado, toss-up 50. The ballet Giselle was partly based on this author's poem, Phantoms. This author's works also inspired the operas La Gioconda and Rigoletto. A novel by this author ends with two skeletons crumbling to dust. This author wrote a novel that begins with the life history of a bishop and has several chapters describing a sewer system. One of his characters saves a gypsy girl from hanging and secludes himself in a cathedral. This author fictionalized the 1832 June Rebellion, which kills Gavroche and Eponine on the barricades in a novel about Jean Valjean. For 10 points, name this author of The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Les Miserables. And that is, of course, Victor Hugo. Toss-up number 51. The preface to the poem states that the poet drew inspiration from Purchas from Purchas his pilgrimage and describes the poem as a psychological curiosity. Places mentioned in this poem include forests ancient as the hills and that deep romantic chasm, the source of a spring which bursts forth, sending huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail. Later, the poet describes a dulcimer being played by an Abyssinian maid and voices prophesying war, and in it, a sunless sea is approached by Alpha, the sacred river. For 10 points, name this poem in which a stately pleasure dome is decreed in Xanadu by the titular Mongol ruler, a poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and that is, of course, Kubla Khan. Toss-up number 52, the last one. In A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf writes that until this author's day, women in fiction were seen only in relation to the other sex. In another of this author's novels, the protagonist tells Captain Harville that men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story. In addition to creating Anne Elliot in Persuasion, this author wrote a novel in which Georgiana is prevented from eloping by her brother, the owner of Pemberley. In that novel by this author, the protagonist discovers Wickham's devious character in a letter from her eventual fiancé, Mr. Darcy. For 10 points, name this author who wrote about Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. And of course, that is Jane Austen. So good luck. I hope that you are studying, that you are learning, and that it was some fun playing these literature toss-ups. Thanks.